So America was encouraging Soviet expansion into Afghanistan at the same time that they were warning them, don't come to Iran and the Persian Gulf, though. And part of that is also part of the legacy of Vietnam. Because after Vietnam, the American people had what was called the Vietnam Syndrome. They didn't want to go do this anymore. After the horrific war in Korea and in Vietnam both, they did not want to contain communism at the expense of their sons and all their dollars like this.
And we actually have our next segment here. Our next guest has showed up, and I'm very excited to have him because he is really one of the, in my opinion, one of the most important anti-war voices that we have. And he is a wealth of information and knowledge on the whole situation, the history and all of it. So we are joined now by Scott Horton. Scott is the director of the Libertarian Institute. He's the editorial director of antiwar.com, host of the Scott Horton Show, and author of such books. Let me pull up his, this is his Twitter page here, but he's author of such books as Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism, and his latest, which is called Provoked, How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine. So Scott Horton, thank you so much for joining us, my friend. I appreciate it. I know you're there at Pork Fest, so I appreciate you taking some time out of your day to join us here on the Jimmy Dore Show.
I'm happy to be here with you guys. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, of course. And when Jimmy asked me to guest host the show, I immediately thought of you, given the situation that we are in currently, because you are a wealth of knowledge on all things foreign policy. And so I wanted to, let me get that. There we go. I wanted to get your take on all of this. So I wanted to we're going to kind of break this up into a couple different segments. So I want to start with a little bit of what Jimmy was just talking about there. Wanted to talk about a little bit of the history here, because Jimmy just mentioned that, 1953, we overthrew Mossadegh. And then that really, to your mind, is that really what kicked off this whole, the modern situation that we're in with Iran?
Yes, ma'am, absolutely. My book, Enough Already, basically starts with the Iranian Revolution in 1979. In other words, the coup in 1953. And of course, so what happened was America launched Operation Ajax. And there's a great CIA history of this by a guy named Donald Wilbur that people can read all about how they did it and everything. And this is when the phrase blowback was coined. It was coined by Wilbur in that history and warned about, the potential of blowback coming down the line from operations like this. And then it was 26 years later. Wait, how much time do we have to tell this story?
I mean, I know we could let Scott talk for 2 hours and he would educate us all. So go into it.
I'll talk fast. So listen, I like telling this story. I'll try to make it concise. In the aftermath of the Vietnam War, Dick Cheney, I get him confused. Richard Nixon had a problem, which was the military-industrial complex was mad at him for ending the war. And so he decided what he would do is he would put pressure on the Shah to increase weapons purchases from the United States. It was one of the things that really helped weaken his regime in the 1970s, was his sellout to the United States like this, in a very poor country. And now he's got all these fancy F-4s and F-14s, which is why he has F-4. They have F-4s and F-14s to this day, is because of that. And that really helped undermine support for his regime at that time. Now, he was dying of cancer and revolution was breaking out. He had already fled the country and was in Latin America, and Jimmy Carter's government decided that they would not encourage the military to massacre everybody in the street, but would instead essentially allow the revolution to proceed. And the CIA and the State Department advised the White House that this guy Khomeini, who's in exile in Paris, France, who had been living in Iraq for a while and then had moved to Paris, we like him, we know him, he's a friend of ours from back in 53, when he was part of a group of conservative Shiite clerics who helped agitate against Mossadegh. So we think we can work with him. It'll be okay. So you might have seen Peter Jennings interviewing Ayatollah Khomeini on the plane on the way back to Tehran. That was what was going on there. Jimmy Carter told the French to send him home to inherit the revolution. And most people never understand this. They never say this, that the original revolution was at the end of 78 and beginning of 79, really culminating in February of 79. The hostage crisis didn't break out until November. So for the first 10 months of the revolution, the United States was passing intelligence to the Ayatollah. The regime had kept their old intelligence agency intact and much of the government intact. And America was warning them about threats from the Soviet Union and about threats from Saddam Hussein, the new Sunni dictator who had just overthrown his predecessor in a bloody coup d'etat in Iraq that same year. Then what happened was David Rockefeller convinced Jimmy Carter to let the Shah into the United States for cancer treatment. And that sent a signal to the people of Iran unintentionally that we meant to nurse him back to health and reinstall him on the throne with force. And that was what caused the riot. And I'm not saying it was just student led. It may very well have been the Revolutionary Guard Corps who led the thing or what, but that was what touched off the riot and the seizing of the hostages, the burning of our flags, and the chants of death to America, the great Satan, and all the things are basically the only things that people remember about that revolution, when it was blowback from so many blunders from everyone from Eisenhower through Nixon and Ford, and including Jimmy Carter himself, in the way that they played that thing. And then what happened was, in a reaction and then I need to add, they launched a failed rescue mission called Operation Eagle Claw, where they tried to go rescue the hostages, and the whole thing was botched. And on their way out of there, they were already calling it off, aborting the mission. And then a helicopter crashed into a plane, and a bunch of guys were killed, and it was a total, disaster. So Carter was humiliated. So then in his State of the Union speech in January of 1980, he announced the Carter Doctrine. And the Carter Doctrine was mostly based around the idea of threatening the Soviet Union that they better not invade Iran. Even though we just lost control of Iran, and we're still giving them a war guarantee essentially to keep the USSR out. Now, what's interesting about that is part of the reason they were so concerned about that was that at the same time, they had helped, the same year, 79, they had helped lure the Soviet Union into invading Afghanistan. And it's not really the case that American support for the Mujahideen caused the USSR to invade, but that's what they were trying to do. And the USSR did invade based on the fact that their sock puppet commie dictator in Kabul was unable to hold on to power there, and they needed to replace him. They took him out back and shot him and replaced him with a new guy as soon as they invaded. And then, so America was encouraging Soviet expansion into Afghanistan at the same time that they were warning them, don't come to Iran and the Persian Gulf, though. And part of that is also part of the legacy of Vietnam. Because after Vietnam, the American people had what was called the Vietnam Syndrome. They didn't want to go do this anymore. After the horrific war in Korea and in Vietnam both, they did not want to contain communism at the expense of their sons and all their dollars like this. And so what happened was a strategist in the Pentagon named Walter Slocum and Zbigniew Brzezinski came up with the idea that we would deliberately try to encourage the Soviet Union into expanding. Forget containment. We'll bait them into expanding their commitments in Latin America, in Africa, and especially into Afghanistan. We didn't want them to invade West Berlin, but but the Afghans, they're expendable. By the way, 1 million Afghans died in the Soviets' horrific war there in the 1980s. And this is where America began backing the Mujahideen, not just in Afghanistan, but the Arab Afghan Army, the International Islamist Brigades that were built up by the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Britain and Pakistan to fight against the Soviet Union in the 1980s. We've all seen Rambo 3 where they make it look more indigenous, but it was CIA support for all of that. Now, this all ties together, so bear with me. As part of the Carter Doctrine, Jimmy Carter starts expanding all of his bases into the Middle East, first of all. And he also gives Saddam Hussein, the new dictator of Iraq, who, as I said, had just taken power in a bloody coup, gave him the green light to invade Iran. Now, Saddam Hussein had an important reason to invade Iran, okay? Saddam Hussein was a Sunni representing a 20% minority, essentially fascist dictatorship, the Ba'athist Party dictatorship of the country, lording it over the 60% supermajority Kurdish, the 60% supermajority Shiite Arab population and the 20% Kurdish population who live in the north. Now, the Kurds are Sunnis, but not Arabs. And the Shiite Arabs are are Arabs, but not Sunnis, right? You with me? So Saddam is afraid that his supermajority Shiite population in the south and east of the country are going to now side with the Iranian fundamentalist Shiite revolution, and that they're going to choose their religious sect over their national sect as Iraqis or their ethnic sect as Arabs. And they're going to side with the revolution and maybe take it to Baghdad. So Saddam Hussein is afraid of this. This is his motive to invade. He's going to take that Shiite supermajority population and conscript them and force them to fight against Iran for him. That way, to neutralize their threat to him and Iran's threat to using them against him. This is a horrific war, which is like a Ukraine-Russia style trench warfare, absolute brutal World War I style catastrophe for Iran and Iraq through the 1980s, where America supports Saddam Hussein, including helping him buy chemical weapons from the Germans and develop his capacity to make his own, and including giving him satellite targeting information to use to target Iranian forces, which, yes, included child soldiers, but also included the civilian population centers in Iran with not just mustard gas, but sarin and Tabun nerve gas and all of this horrific stuff. It was an absolutely horrific war. And by the way, the Ayatollah's regime was very shaky until Saddam invaded. As Randolph Bourne taught, war is the health of the state. Just like when America started bombing Yemen, they said, we're all Houthis now, even though they weren't. But just the way Americans supported Bush after we were attacked, that's kind of the way that goes. And so that was what helped solidify the Ayatollah's hold on power rather than overthrowing him. Now, at the end of that war, Saddam Hussein was broke, and he owed a bunch of money to UAE, Bahrain, and Kuwait. Pardon me, UAE, Saudi, and Kuwait. And they were all calling in their war debts, and they were being real jerks about it, especially the Kuwaitis. And long story short, the State Department essentially gave Saddam Hussein permission to invade Kuwait, to take the northern oil fields, to move the border another few tens of miles south as punishment for Kuwait's overproduction of their shared oil wells and even slant drilling into the Iraqi side. And this was James Baker, the Secretary of State's permission to Iraq. Go ahead, break their knees, see if I care. But Hussein got too big for his britches, and he went all the way to the coast. Now, originally, America was going to let him get away with that. And Colin Powell announced, he was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the head of the National Security Council meeting at the time. And they said, as long as he doesn't move on Saudi Arabia, it's fine. But then Margaret Thatcher came to town, the Prime Minister of Great Britain. And she said, don't you go wobbly on me now, Bush. In other words, calling out his manhood as compared to hers. And that was when he said, this will not stand. Now, the British had big investments in Kuwait, and Kuwait had big investments in British debt. But that didn't have anything to do with us. But oh well, Americans are just suckers for this kind of stuff. So playing like they're the Israelis or whatever, maybe the Israelis are imitating the British now. This is how they did it, and it helped get us into Iraq War I. And by the way, they could have negotiated our way out of that war numerous times. Hussein was willing to give in and trying to be our friend. So anyway, they launched Iraq War I, which everyone says was just great. It was Operation Yellow Ribbon. As Bush Sr. said, we beat Vietnam syndrome. The American people love war again. Now we can do war whenever we want again. This is just great. And the war lasted just a few weeks of air war and 100 hours of ground war. And everybody thought it was fine. But fewer people noticed that in the aftermath of that war, the Bush administration, Bush Sr. this is, 1991, encouraged the Shiite supermajority and the Kurdish minority in the north to rise up and overthrow Saddam Hussein. And they did. They thought they were going to have American support. They dropped leaflets and made radio announcements. I'm going somewhere with this, I swear to God. And then, so the Shiites did rise up, but then Bush and his government changed their mind. Why? They changed their mind because remember when I said Saddam Hussein was afraid that the Iraqi Shiites were going to side with the Iranians in 1980, and that was why he launched the Iran-Iraq war? Well, some Iraqis had sided with Iran and had fled to Iran and had even fought on Iran's side in the war. Well, now they were coming across the border to lead the revolution, namely the Badr Brigade of the Supreme Islamic Council. And so when the Bush administration realized this, they said, wait a minute, we just spent a decade supporting Saddam Hussein to contain the Iranian Revolution. Now we are importing it into Iraq. And that was why they changed their mind and stabbed those Shiites in the back like a giant bay of pigs and let Saddam Hussein massacre 100,000 people to put down that revolt. Then that became the excuse for America to stay in Saudi Arabia in order to enforce the no-fly zones over Iraq and the blockade against Iraq in order to, first of all, supposedly protect the Shiites, even though the insurrection was over. He wasn't just going to kill them all. And to enforce the blockade, which was meant, as the Bush administration said, Bush Sr. himself and Robert Gates, who worked for him, and the Clinton administration later reaffirmed, the sanctions stay, the total global economic embargo stays until Saddam Hussein falls from power. This, my friends, then is what caused Al Qaeda, America's sock puppet, mercenary, suicide bomber, head chopper, Salafi terrorists that they used in Afghanistan and then that Bill Clinton used in Bosnia and in Kosovo and in Chechnya. And that is with various degrees of support. I'm not saying, as some people leap to conclusions, that the CIA just controlled these people's every behavior. What they did was they encouraged, especially the Saudis, to support them and encourage them. And hell, the British had more operational control over a lot of these mujahideen than the Americans did. But as I show in my book, 10 of the 19 September 11th hijackers had fought in Bosnia and or Chechnya on America's side before they hit the United States. Now, I know a lot of people watching this are truthers and they're just going to be mad at me for not being one, but I don't care, because the deal is this. The real truth is what Ron Paul said, just like always, and that is it's blowback. Because just even though Bill Clinton and his government were supporting these mujahideen, did not mean that they controlled everything about them. And Al Qaeda's war against the United States had clear motives and a clear strategy. And the clear motives were first and foremost, and first and second most, I guess, the occupation of the Holy Arabian Peninsula, where the birthplace of Muhammad and the birthplace of the religion of Islam at Mecca and Medina, in order to continuously bomb Iraq for the entire decade after Iraq War I and enforce that blockade, which was starving people to death by the hundreds of thousands, even though those numbers were embellished. You know, the UN embellished them up to 500,000, which was not true, but it was still like 300,000, which is already absolutely horrific war crime anyway. Bin Laden himself would embellish it up to 600,000 or sometimes even 1,000,000 and say 1,000,000 children have died in the blockade or whatever. And this became enforced from Saudi Arabia, which, you know, Tom Cruise could have done it from a carrier in the Gulf. Did it have to be the Air Force too, you know? And by the way, and people forget this, Al Qaeda attack, they killed Rabbi Kahane in 1990. They attacked the Radisson Hotel and killed Americans in Yemen in 1992. They did the first World Trade Center bombing in 93. Ask me a follow-up about that later if you want, but it was not an inside job. The FBI could have stopped it, but failed to. But that was Al Qaeda that did that. It was Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's nephew, Ramzi Youssef, cooked that bomb. Okay, then they killed Americans training the Saudi National Guard in 95. And they also got busted for the Bojinka plot. Ramzi Youssef, who did the first World Trade Center bombing, his buddies got busted in the Philippines, and their laptop contained a plan to kill Bill Clinton, kill the Pope, to time bomb 12 planes over the Pacific, and the planes operation, to hijack 10 planes and crash them into landmarks on America's coasts. And then Khalid Sheikh Mohammed would get on the microphone and demand an end to the Israeli occupation. Right, this was that happened. Then in 1996, it was Bin Laden and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed bombed the Khobar Towers. What was that? They killed 19 American airmen who were stationed there to bomb Iraq. And that's who died. And what did Bill Clinton and Louis Freeh and the Saudis do? They blamed it on Iranian-backed Saudi Hezbollah. Right? Iran did it for no reason at all from across the Gulf when they're trying to suck up to us at that time. And so that was a lie. It was the Al Qaeda that did that. And then they did the Africa Embassy attack in 98. and they attempted to to attack one of our cruisers, the USS the Sullivans, except the dinghy sank. But then they succeeded in their attack on the USS Cole in the year 2000. That wasn't the CIA that did all of that, folks. That was Al Qaeda that was trying to bait the United States into war. In fact, I skipped one. It was bin Laden's men who helped do Black Hawk Down in 1993 and kill the Americans in Mogadishu. And bin Laden later complained he was trying to provoke Bill Clinton into invading Somalia so he could fight a war of attrition against the United States there. The same Afghan strategy that we had helped them do to the Soviets, that they would later do to us in Afghanistan. And so their motives were American occupation of Saudi and bombing Iraqis. It was support for Israel and their brutal occupation of their helpless Palestinian captives, as well as the people of southern Lebanon. And it was also support for the dictatorships in the region and pressure on them to rig the oil price in our favor, to subsidize our economy at their expense, and supposedly ignoring a blind eye to Russia and China's violence against them, which was ridiculous. We're supporting them against both. America supported the Uyghurs against the Chinese during this time as well. Don't let me leave that out. But so this was their motive, and their strategy was they were trying to get America to invade Afghanistan, to break America's empire the same way we had helped them do to the Soviet Union. And that's why they hit us on September 11th. And quite frankly, the truth is obscure the reality of all that. That what honestly, this is the story, okay, is that Mohammed Atta and Ramzi bin al-Shibh, they were engineering students, Egyptian engineering students studying in Hamburg, Germany. And after Israel invaded Lebanon in 1996, it was actually Naftali Bennett, who was the artillery officer who called in a strike on a UN shelter and killed 106 women and children. And when bin Laden put out his first declaration of war against the United States in 1996, it was called Declaration of War Against the Americans Occupying the Land of the Two Holy Places. And in the very beginning of it, he goes on and on about the Qana massacre during Operation Grapes of Wrath. And it was when Ramzi bin al-Shibh and Mohammed Atta read that they said they wanted to go and join Al Qaeda. And their first stop was to try to go to Chechnya. They later went to Afghanistan, and then having Western passports, they were the obvious guys to use for the planes operation in the United States. And so here are Egyptian engineering students studying in Hamburg, Germany, volunteer for a Saudi sheikh hiding in Afghanistan to kill Americans as revenge for our support for what Israel's doing in Lebanon. And that, Jimmy Dore, is why they told you they hate you because you're free. Because they didn't want to tell you it was all of that instead. And then what happened, we all know. They went to Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, Libya, Syria, Iraq again, Yemen, and now with all of their continued support for the horrific war against the poor, helpless Palestinians locked in the Gaza Strip, and now with this supposedly preemptive, preventative war against a civilian nuclear program in Iran that was no threat to Israel or the United States of America. And I will shut up here because I'm sure y'all probably want to ask me something about all that. But you asked me what from 79 led to all this, and that's the answer right there. That's the story.
That's why I brought you, Scott Horton.
Come see us on tour. We're going to be in Toronto again, Red Bank, New Jersey, Northampton, Massachusetts, Concord, New Hampshire, Rutherford, New Jersey, Edmonton, Calgary, Vancouver. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for tickets.